The reading today, again, was from the book of Acts, and we've been looking at the book of Acts. And once again today, we'll see the story of a woman who is very instrumental in the advance of the Christian gospel to Europe in this reading today. But I want to start with another person that's more recent. A year ago, this past week, Sarah Johnson, who was a member of our church, passed away. We received, within the last couple of months, a gift from her estate. It was a significant gift, and we were very grateful for that. Sarah's generosity in her death, not only to our congregation, but to other organizations like the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, the Florida Baptist Children's Homes, Stetson University, etc., was a tribute to not just her generosity when it came to financial contributions, but her life itself was a tremendous example of someone using their gifts, their resources, their skills to help others, to promote human flourishing for a large number of people. I wanted to share with you, I was asked recently to write a short bio on her, and I want to share with you the words because I think she's someone today that needs to be remembered, but also it's pertinent to what I want to talk about in the sermon. I'll read the words to you from my version of her bio. Sarah Johnson had a tremendous desire to serve others. Orphaned at 10 years of age, Sarah, along with her younger brother, L.C., moved from Jennings, Florida to the Florida Baptist Children's Home, then located in Arcadia. Sarah met her future husband, Joseph Johnson, and the two of them modeled a lifelong devotion to the care of children. After graduating from Stetson University in 1949, Sarah and Joe would marry in Lakeland and begin working at the children's home here. In 1953, Sarah and Joe were asked to move to Miami and open a new campus of the Florida Baptist Children's Home there. They became the co-directors of the Miami campus and served successfully in that ministry for 7 years. Afterwards, they both went to work as educators in Miami public schools, where they were employed until they retired in 1989. They decided to return to Lakeland to live their retirement years here, where they both could continue to be actively involved as volunteers at the children's home. I met Sarah Johnson in 2007 when I became pastor of the Lakeland Fellowship. The Lakeland Fellowship, now the Beacon Hill Fellowship, was a community of faith partnering with the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. Though I'd never had the opportunity to meet Joe, who passed away in 1999, it became quickly apparent that Sarah Johnson's dedication to serving others had not dissipated in retirement. She exemplified the lifestyle of a missional Christian. Sarah maintained a rigorous schedule of involvement in the Florida Baptist Children's Home, Stetson University, the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, and other local efforts to empower the least of these to experience a life of human flourishing. It was not uncommon for her to, quote-unquote, go missing, only to discover that she had loaded her car with items she independently transported to various ministries across the state of Florida. Even when she lost the ability to drive, she could be found serving those around her, like reading to other residents at the Florida Presbyterian homes where she resided in her last years. Sarah was always appreciative of how Baptist Christians had been there for her, and she always wanted to be there for others. She reminds me of the words of Jesus, who said, "To whom much is given, much will be required." Sarah Johnson met and exceeded those requirements. As I thought about this message today and how a woman named Lydia, a businesswoman in this case, was so instrumental in advancing the good news about Jesus to a new continent, as we think of today, to Europe for the first time, I thought about Sarah Johnson and the fact that this just happened to be the anniversary week of her death. I thought mentioning her would be a good way to segue into how you see throughout the biblical as well as the Christian record of history, if you look closely and you pay attention to what's really happening on the ground, the role that individuals, in this case, individual women, played in furthering the cause of the Christian message. On Mother's Day, I recited a variety of different ways throughout the narrative of the two-volume work work called Luke Acts of how women were crucial to the spread of the message about the kingdom of God. And once again, we're introduced in this particular reading today to another such woman. And I want to talk about her. I remind you the words that Ralph read just a moment ago. A certain woman named Lydia, a worshiper of God, was listening to us. She was from the city of Thyatira. I always tell people, don't worry about how you pronounce the cities. We talked about it in the Bible study today. I'm from Alabama. We call it Birmingham, but if you go to England, it's Birmingham. Some of you who are familiar with South Georgia, you've lived near Albany, but if you go to New York, it's Albany. So don't worry about how to pronounce the names of these cities. Just say it boldly. I'm going to go with Thyatira. And she was a dealer in purple cloth. The Lord opened her heart to listen eagerly to what was said by Paul. When she and her household were baptized, she urged us, saying, "If you have judged me faithful to the Lord, come and stay at my home." And she prevailed upon us. NIV says she persuaded us. She won the debate with Paul. So what's happening in the story? Well, it's a significant movement in this two-volume work I call Luke Acts, because you reach a point where you realize that the gospel continues to expand across the Mediterranean world. Really, the narrative is about how the good news about Jesus spread from Jerusalem to Rome. But we reach that point where Paul is moving across a region that's called Asia. Now, that's very confusing. When we think of Asia, we think of something different. This is actually what we would call modern Turkey. And the region we're talking about is modern Turkey and southern Europe, what is called modern Greece, across the Aegean Sea. Asia is always relative, by the way. The word Asia just simply means east. So we could say that, Winter Haven's Asia to us, because east is, east of where you are. But this is east from the perspective of somebody who thought in terms of Rome as being the center of the world. So Asia Minor it's sometimes called, is Turkey. Paul has been moving around, really following the Roman road system to various places to spread the good news about Jesus. And he wants to go into new areas. But the story says that Paul and his companions are prevented by the Spirit, or the Spirit of Jesus, from going to certain regions in that general area of modern-day Turkey. We're not told exactly how that worked, but Paul and his companions perceived that they were, wandering about, not exactly sure where the Lord was going to lead them. So they end up in the seaport city of Troas. And there at night, Paul receives a vision, it says, from a man from Macedonia. This is across the Aegean Sea, who says, "Come over and help us." And Paul concludes, as well as his companions, that they need to go to what we would call southern Europe, to a region called Macedonia. That's now really a part of modern-day Greece. He ends up in a city by the name of Philippi of the district of Macedonia, named after Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great. It also happens to be a Roman colony. When he goes to that city, first of all, crosses the sea by boat, best way to do it in those days, ends up in the seaport town of Neapolis, proceeds on to Philippi. Philippi apparently doesn't have a formal synagogue. In that time period, to form a synagogue, you had at least to have 10 Jewish males to establish a synagogue. So it says they went down by the river near the city, and they had heard there was a place of prayer there. This would have been a place of prayer, apparently mostly Jewish women. And it says they met with the women there. There makes no mention of men. Again, throughout Luke Acts, the author of this two-volume work emphasizes how women were such a crucial part of the story. And here it is again. Paul is meeting with a group of Jewish women, but there's also another woman there who we're told is a worshiper of God, but the implication is that she is a Gentile, not a Jew. See, there were Gentiles who admired the God of Israel. They admired Judaism, but there were still social and cultural barriers that kept them apart. Well, this woman is there, and she is a businesswoman from a place called Thyatira in the district of Lydia. Now that sounds interesting, doesn't it? She is Lydia from Thyatira in the Asia Minor district of Lydia. That's like meeting a woman who is from Atlanta named Georgia. I don't know. That's just what the story says. So in this group of women, Paul encounters this woman, and it says the Lord opened her heart to receive Paul's message. Now, she was already interested, apparently, in the God of Israel. She was a worshiper of the God of Israel. But she hears the message about Jesus, and it says that the Lord opened her heart, and she believed it. And she didn't just stop there. She didn't just become a believer in Jesus as Messiah, the Christ. She said she wants to go a step further. She wants to use her resources. Now, she's a businesswoman, seller in purple cloth. Thyatira, by the way, was a place that was well known for its trade of purple and purple cloth. So she's located in a Roman colony, which just so happens in the Roman colony of Philippi, the magistrates and some other dignitaries enjoyed wearing purple. It was customary to wear purple. So she's an opportunistic businesswoman, and she becomes a follower of Jesus, but she wants to open up a home that she has in Philippi to Paul and his companions. And she persuades them. She prevails upon them, so they agree. So her home becomes not just a place for Paul and his companions to live while they're in Philippi, it also becomes the place where the first church, if you will, the first gathering, the first assembly of Christian disciples in Europe is to be found. This story starts with Lydia's home, and it ends with Lydia's home. But in the middle are some very intriguing stories. For as Paul and his companions, Paul and Silas, Timothy, maybe some others, maybe even the author of this travel narrative, as they're using Lydia's home as the base of their operation, they begin to go out and preach the gospel to the city of Philippi. And in the process of doing that, this young fortune-telling girl begins to follow them along. We're told she is a slave girl, and that her owners are using this ability that she had, whatever it was. We're told it was a spirit of the python. Now, if you know anything about the ancient world, the spirit of the python was associated with a particular area of the Greek world where prophecies, fortune-telling was well known. And this woman is said to have the spirit of the python, so she follows Paul and Silas around, apparently frequently, shouting about them. These are men who represent God and so forth like that. And it irritates Paul apparently because he finally reaches a point where he turns around and he rebukes the spirit and it leaves her. And it says that the young woman is no longer of any profit to her owners because she loses its ability to apparently tell fortunes. Well, this makes the owners mad with Paul and Silas because they've lost the means of their economic means at this woman's expense. And so they stir up the people. They bring them to the magistrates, the people who like to wear purple cloth. And the magistrates, it says the crowd actually begins to attack them. The magistrates decide to beat them with rods and have them thrown in prison. So that's what happens to Paul and Silas. They're beaten with rods. They're thrown in prison. They're handed over to the jailer, the second character in this, well, you could call it the third character in this story about Philippi. The jailer, we're told, puts them in the innermost cell, shackles them down to the floor. And these people have been beaten with rods, so you can imagine this jailer is pretty brutal. And he leaves them there. And it says along about midnight that Paul and Silas were praying and they were singing hymns to God. And something dramatic happened. Something that was not terribly unusual in that part of the world, but the timing is, well, important. An earthquake occurs. And it says the prison was shaken to its foundation, the doors of the prison were thrown open, the shackles broke off, the jailer wakes up, I presume he wakes up, it's midnight. He runs in, grabs his sword, and he's about ready to, he thinks he's responsible for all these prisoners and they're all gone. So he starts to kill himself. And Paul shouts out, "Do yourself no harm, we're all still here." And the jailer comes in and Paul shares a message about Jesus. And the jailer, we're told, his entire household, just like Lydia and her household, came to embrace Jesus as the Christ. And then he ends up treating Paul and Silas's wounds and feeding them and taking care of them for the rest of the night. Next morning, the magistrate sent word to to Paul and Silas. I have to wonder if Lydia didn't have a little pull there, the local seller of purple. But the magistrates sent for Paul and Silas and said to release the men, let them go and let them leave the city. And Paul, for the first time in the narrative of the book of Acts, lets us know that he happens to be a Roman citizen. He says, we are Roman citizens, and you have beaten us and condemned us and imprisoned inappropriately, without a justifiable charge. See, Paul's not enough. He's not satisfied with letting them secretly kind of leave the city, leaving the impression that they had done something wrong to begin with. Paul wants to bring them up on reverse charges that they had violated the standards of justice that Rome expected, especially related to its citizens. By the way, this is the author of Luke Acts, his way, once again, of showing that when Christianity, the early Christian movement, was charged with a false accusation, that in the end they're later exonerated. You find this all throughout Luke Acts. Time and time again, they're judged innocent or not guilty of the charges brought against them. And this is just another example of that. So they're freed. So what do Paul and Silas do? Where do they go? They don't leave the city. We're told they go back to the home of Lydia and visit with the brothers and sisters to encourage them before they move on to the next city. So this story effectively starts out in the home of Lydia, and then, as far as Philippi is concerned, ends in the home of Lydia. And throughout, this woman uses her means, uses her resources to provide a base of operation for the first Christian movement into Europe, for which we are all thankful for in this room. And the story is told in such a way as the Spirit is orchestrating all of this. Interestingly enough, Paul and his companions left Asia Minor because it said the Spirit kept guiding them away from the places they intended to go, ends up in another place in what we call Southern Europe, meets a woman from Asia Minor, one of the areas they were not permitted to go, and the rest is history, according to Luke. What am I saying here today? This is another example of how people, in this case a woman, apparently a well-to-do woman, presumably she has a home in Thyatira as well as in Philippi. She has a household. We're never told she has a husband, so presumably he had died, because a household usually includes other family members, perhaps servants. But she uses her resources as a base of operation to allow the Christian message about Jesus to continue to spread so that more people could hear it and more people's lives would be transformed. Specifically, an example of a young slave girl who's been taken advantage of unjustly by her owners. And then another individual who intends to end his life because he's in despair over a tragedy he thinks has occurred and is irreversible. In both cases, the good news about Jesus rescues people from others, and it rescues people from themselves. And it was all made possible because a woman persuaded and prevailed upon Paul and his companions and shared her resources for the good of the gospel and for the transformation of human lives. Now, this is not the first time we've encountered purple cloth in the Luke Acts narrative. There's another time earlier in Luke where purple cloth has a bad association. Does anybody remember where that is? It's the story of a man who is unnamed in the story, simply called a rich man. He's a rich man who was clothed in purple cloth and fine linen, and it says he fared sumptuously every day. That means he ate all he wanted and drank all he wanted. And outside of the compound of his house was a poor man by the name of Lazarus. And it says this rich man, clothed in purple cloth, the finest that he could buy, the finest that he could purchase, having the best of everything, presumably would pass by this poor man Lazarus every day and not give him a thing. He is shown to be in the storyline an example of someone with great wealth who completely ignores those who are in his path that he could help. Well, once again in the Acts narrative, we're introduced to a woman who sells purple cloth to people who can afford it, which would be wealthy people. She moved in some high and mighty circles, but instead of being like the rich man who ignored Lazarus, she used her purple cloth to empower and deliver poor slave girls and brutal jailers who are about to give up on life itself. What am I saying today? I'm saying no, all of us, no matter who we are or what we have got to find a way of living beyond simply the next meal, the next nice thing we can buy, the next shopping trip, that there's a higher purpose for us all. Lydia modeled that. She modeled an example of living strategically for the good of God and others. And she did it in a practical way that we can all look back on our own faith histories and realize was instrumental in our hearing the gospel ourselves. Because remember, if the gospel had never made it out of what they called Asia, it would almost certainly have disappeared and died, and we would have never heard it. But because of a woman by the name of Lydia from Thyatira, in the district of Lydia, we're perhaps sitting here today continuing to tell her story, and more importantly, the story about Jesus, who transforms lives, who rescues people from others and rescues people from themselves. And so today, when I think of people like Sarah Johnson, and I think of many people that all of us can point to in our lives, women and men, who have used their resources to bring about good and to promote human flourishing, it's a reminder to all of us to ask ourselves, what are we doing? How are we living? Do we see ourselves as people who are living strategically with a greater goal than simply survival? What are we doing to transform the lives of people around us? That's what it means to live strategically for God and others.